The Colours That Blind, Chapter 36. I stood outside the back door of a little restaurant in Main Street, deep in the heart of the city of Umtali. It had been a while since I had been this exposed to privilege. But even when I had been in Salisbury, I'd never been allowed to wander to the heart of the city. Philip had said nothing when they had left to go inside, except that I was to stand there by the door and wait. Matthew had only watched me in silence. He seemed to be stuck in a dilemma. I hadn't heard what his uncle had said to him about blood and water, but I didn't need to be any kind of genius to figure it out. I peeked through the back door of the little restaurant to see if Matthew and Philip were on their way out. A middle-aged woman sat inside at the far end, fanning herself with a bottle of cola in front of her. I smiled nervously at her and she looked away. The men had been in there for about 20 minutes, although it was beginning to feel like an eternity. A man passed with a little boy young enough to be his grandson. When the little boy saw me, he smiled and waved. But as soon as the man saw, he whisked the little boy into his arms, his hand covering his grandson's nose. I shook my head. Even anger could not come out, only colour, and yet a grown man feared he might breathe it onto his skin. My eyes drifted to the sign hanging slightly above my head with its letters, big and bold. Ethiopians only, dogs and Africans not allowed. I remember seeing the white van with two threatening blue stripes as it drove from the road to the curb where I stood. I remember how my heart jolted within me, scampering in all directions and looking for a place to run to. I remember breathing as slowly as I could, fearing that even my breath was criminal. 5 men descended from the car, one holding a leash to a panting German shepherd with glimmering amber eyes. That gave away that he was looking for someone to devour. I was asked once how I came to be prayerful. I'm sure God laughs about it, the girl who breathed in and whispers a little prayer as she watched vultures strut towards her. Impressed, khaki uniform and brown shoes. "What are you doing here, girlie?" one of the men asked. The dog sniffed at me, and the officer with the leash yanked at it, pulling it back. "I'm waiting for Mr. Rogg. I'm waiting for my boss, sir. You know you're not supposed to be here, don't you?" "Yes, sir." "What is your name?" Another officer asked. I froze. "Ros Thranduil." Officer. Sir." I could feel the dog's breath kissing my skin and my nerves melting into shivers. "Let me see your pass, then." My armpit stung, and I peered back into the restaurant again. I swallowed as I watched that middle-aged lady now, standing up, moving towards us. "My boss, sir," he said. "My boss, he has it, sir." "That's the thing with your bloody Kaffirs, always ungrateful, never respecting the law." "Officer, oh, I'm so glad you came. I was so worried. This is who I spoke to you about on the phone. She has been standing here suspiciously for hours. I was so afraid that she might throw a bomb in here. You know, you can never be too careful with these Africans." I looked at the woman confused. "You did well to ring us, ma'am. We don't want a repeat of what happened last week." She nodded, satisfied with herself. And in that moment I remembered how Baba had mentioned something about a bomb going off on one of the suburbs in Umtali, how the security forces had then set a curfew for everyone's safety. It was ironic, Mumskaroo, that after years of bloodshed they had only noticed that people were unsafe. When the war had tired of being hidden in the massacred trees of the reserves and had scuttered into their careful trimmed hedges, I watched as one of the officers consoled the woman, who was seemingly distraught and shaken by it, and although I only knew he was speaking because his lips moved, his words escaped me as I hung on to myself, praying. One of the 5 men unhooked a pair of handcuffs that jangled on his belt. "Officer, my boss, he's in there." I tried, my heart speeding up. The other men laughed and I held my breath, afraid that maybe all the anger and fear would merge into each other and erupt. I stepped back as the man reached for my arms. The dog pulled at its leash, snarling and barking and showing its teeth. Before I had gone into Salisbury for my training, Baba and Amayi had set me down. "You never run if the security forces stop you. You hear, Thranduil?" Baba had hissed, and Ami had pulled his arm to calm down. "You do as you're told. You remember that we have no one on our side. You must remember that we have not taken back the land yet." That had been the end of the conversation. I took another step back as the dog barked, jerking in my direction, hungry for a bite. I had given up on Matthew and Philip, given in to the idea that this was why they had brought me here. And though I am old now, Mum's Karuru, and my memory sometimes fails me, I can never forget how I thought to myself, "You're alone, Thranduil. There is no one here who will stand for you." It must have been the very moment when my distinct desire to remain alive overrode all of Baba and Ami's teaching, because at that moment the brakes on my feet broke and I charged past the unsuspecting officers. I'm not even sure where I thought I was going or how far I thought I would get, but I ran as fast as my legs would oblige, speeding away. I could hear the loud barking sounds of the dog and the mad fury of the chasing feet behind me, but even then I ran. And without having gone far, I found myself face to face with the ground, my right cheek pressed on the tarmac, and I remember wailing as the face of the raging dog came close to mine. I don't remember it exactly, but I remember my screams as the dog's teeth punched through the skin of my jaw, chewing at me like a piece of biltong, and my tears, I remember them too. One of the officers twisted my arm behind me and I winced at the click of the cuff, and as I lay there on the ground, I thought mercy had smiled at me at the sight of Philip exiting the restaurant with a frown on his face, trotting in our direction. "What's happened here?" "Boss Philip, please tell them I'm with you," I struggled to say, blood filling my mouth and pain thrashing on my jaw. "What's happened? What has she done, officers?" One of the policemen, whose knee was not right in my rib, smiled as he saw Philip, a smile that spoke of recognition and possible friendship. "Philip, I should have known you'd have a hand in it if trouble was around. George, I see they finally gave you handcuffs." Carefree laughter ripped from him and coated in confidence that things like this could never happen to him. "She belongs to you, Philip. It depends what you did what did she do?" "Well, scared that poor lady half to death, threatening to bomb the place. Girlie here has no papers too, nothing. She says she's with you, but you know after those attacks last week, if we just can't let them walk around as they please, it'll only create more problems." Although I could not see very clearly, I could see that one of the officers was standing slightly away from the rest of them, trapped in a precarious uneasiness that drew my eyes to him. I watched as he tried his best to make sure that his eyes didn't break any laws and mix with mine. At first I thought my sight was simply offending to him, but something about his expression when he eventually looked at me urged pity within me. His eyes seemed to bear fear and beg forgiveness, as though he too was a little hare pinned into a corner, just like me. "Oh no, we certainly can't have that happening again. What do you propose we do then, George? Unless you're willing to come to the station with us so that we can get your support of her in the books, I'm afraid we're going to have to lock her up until the real Mr. Rogers comes to get her, if he wants her back." "Oh, so old man Rogers is real Mr. Rogers, you mean?" Philip said, laughing. The other officer's voice went quiet, and he leaned in closer to Philip as though he was afraid the other would hear. "Also, bringing in another potential terrorist will really go a long way towards the promotion they've been promising me. You know how it works." Philip crackled, and I almost believed he would say it, that he would sell me to them. I heard Matthew before I saw him, hurrying down the street towards us. "Philip, what is going on?" he asked as soon as he reached us. "Why is Sandy in cuffs?" "Disturbing the peace, Matthew. Girlie here was apparently threatening to bomb that poor woman's tea shop," Philip said, waving a limp hand at the cafe. The other officer nodded in agreement. "What? That doesn't sound right. Can I talk to you for a minute, cousin?" Philip said, gently pulling Matthew aside. He placed his arms on Matthew's shoulder, and for a while, as the officer held me there in cuffs, all I could see were the two men's backs. After a few moments, they returned. "All right, George, we should head back to the farm before it gets late. The real Mr. Rogers will come for the girl, won't he, Matthew?" My eyes scoured Matthew's, begging for him to say something. But his was a silent pool of fearful existence. The weight of blood over water had never been so clear to me. He looked down, and I almost believed that. Although he chose it, it still tore him apart. "You know, Muskaroo, it can feel something like death to be rejected in your own home."